They say that grief is supposed to be a private thing, a quiet corridor you walk down alone, or at least with those who truly loved the person you lost. But as I sat there in the back row of St. Jude's Cathedral, watching the camera crews adjust their lenses and the reporters check their notebooks, I realized that for my family, my father's death wasn't a tragedy, it was a product launch. My father, Art Vance, was a man of silence, a retired postal inspector who spent 40 years tracking lost packages and stolen money orders, a man who believed that the truth was something you found in the small, overlooked details. Now, his face was plastered on a giant digital screen above the altar, a polished, airbrushed version of him that I barely recognized. He looked like a statesman, a hero from a movie, not the man who used to sit on the porch with a worn-out flannel shirt, teaching me how to listen to the rhythm of the crickets. I looked at my hands, the skin cracked and stained from double shifts at the warehouse and the corrosive cleaning agents of the hospital rooms where I had lived for the last 7 months. Then I looked at the front row, at the shimmering silk and the designer lace, and I knew that the man we were burying was already being rewritten. Before we go deeper into the dark secrets of the Vance family, I want to take a small moment, after you hit the like button and leave a comment below. I wish you and your family nothing but sincerity and peace in your lives. Where are you watching this story from? What time is it there? And how old are you this year? Please share with us so we can feel closer together. Let's continue. The air in the cathedral was thick with the scent of lilies and expensive perfume, a cloying combination that made it hard to breathe. Pennsylvania in March is usually gray and unforgiving, but inside these stone walls, Eleanor had created a theater of light. My stepmother, Eleanor, was draped in a black veil that managed to look both devastated and incredibly fashionable. She sat in the front pew, her back perfectly straight, dabbing at her eyes with a lace handkerchief every time a camera shutter clicked nearby. Beside her was Cynthia, her golden child, the daughter who had inherited Eleanor's sharp features and even sharper instincts for the spotlight. Cynthia was holding a hardcover book against her chest as if it were a holy relic. The title, Asterisk, The Last Hero Asterisk, was embossed in gold leaf. It was a memoir of my father's life, or rather, the version of his life that they had invented over the last few months, while I was busy changing his bedsheets and arguing with insurance adjusters in the dark. I stayed in the very last row, near the heavy oak doors, blending into the shadows of the latecomers and the curious neighbors. I didn't want to be a part of their production. My coat was old, and my shoes were scuffed from the countless miles I'd walked between train stations and hospital wings. When I looked at Cynthia, I didn't see a grieving daughter. I saw a performer. She had spent the last 2 weeks doing interviews with local news stations, talking about the spiritual journey of caring for a dying veteran, about the sacrifices she had made to be by his side until the very end. The irony was a cold weight in my stomach. I remembered the nights I had called her, my voice shaking as I told her the doctors didn't think he'd make it through the weekend, only for her to tell me she had a gallery opening or a donor dinner she couldn't possibly miss. She hadn't been there for the seizures, the confusion, or the moments when he cried because he couldn't remember how to swallow. But here she was, the face of devoted daughterhood, selling her story to a world that didn't know the difference between a caregiver and a tourist. The service began with a flourish of organ music that felt too loud, too triumphant for a man who preferred the sound of a quiet radio. Father Miller, a man who I'm certain had only met my father twice in the last decade, stood at the pulpit and began to speak. He spoke of Art Vance as a pillar of the community, a man of unwavering strength. But every few sentences he would gesture toward the front row, praising Eleanor's unmatched grace and Cynthia's heroic dedication. It was a script. I could see the reporters in the gallery scribbling it down. They were capturing the narrative of the grieving widow and the brilliant daughter who had captured her father's soul in a book that was already being scouted for a Netflix limited series. The injustice of it felt like a physical burn. I had spent every cent I owned, nearly $190,000 between my savings and the loans I'd taken out to get him into that immunotherapy trial in Philly. I had worked 12-hour shifts at the warehouse and then caught the 4:00 a.m. train just to sit with him for 2 hours before he woke up. I was broke, I was exhausted, and in this room, I didn't exist. Cynthia stood up to give the eulogy. She walked to the podium with a calculated frailty, leaning slightly on the wood as she looked out at the 200 people in attendance. My father taught me that the greatest gift you can give someone is your time, she began, her voice trembling just enough to be captured by the microphones. In those final months, when the world faded away, it was just the two of us. I sat by his bed, recording his stories, feeling his pulse, knowing that every breath was a blessing I had earned through my presence. A soft murmur of sympathy rippled through the church. Eleanor let out a faint, controlled sob. I felt a surge of nausea. I remembered the Tuesday in November when Dad had been so terrified, clutching my hand and asking why the other one never came to see him. I had made excuses for her, telling him she was working hard, trying to protect him from the realization that his youngest daughter viewed his terminal illness as a career opportunity. I watched as the giant screen transitioned into a slideshow. It was a masterpiece of exclusion. There was art at Cynthia's graduation, art at Eleanor's charity gala, art and Cynthia on a beach in the Hamptons. 20 photos, each one carefully selected to show a family that was whole, happy, and exclusive. I wasn't in a single frame. It was as if I had been cropped out of the last 40 years of history. I thought about the photos I had on my phone, the ones of him laughing at a stupid joke I told while he was hooked up to an IV, the one of us eating cold pizza in a waiting room at midnight. Those weren't aesthetic enough for the book. They were too real, too messy, too much like actual life. My heart was thumping against my ribs, a dull, rhythmic ache. I wanted to stand up and scream. I wanted to tell the woman in the row in front of me, who was dabbing her eyes, that the woman on the stage hadn't paid a single medical bill, that she hadn't even known the name of his oncologist. But I stayed silent. That was what Art had taught me. Observe Evelyn, he used to say. People will tell you exactly who they are if you give them enough rope. As the service drew to a close, and the pallbearers began to move the casket, the crowd started to shift. The media flocked toward the front, eager to get a quote from the author of the year. I slipped out through the side door, unable to watch the staged hugs and the fake condolences for another second. The cold Pennsylvania air hit my face like a slap, a welcome relief from the suffocating atmosphere of the cathedral. I walked toward the edge of the stone steps, looking out at the line of black limousines, waiting to take the important people to the private reception at the Vance estate. A reception I hadn't been invited to. I felt a hand on my shoulder, firm and steady. I turned, expecting a neighbor or maybe Julian, my father's oldest friend, but it was a man I didn't recognize. He was older, wearing a charcoal overcoat and a flat cap pulled low over his eyes. He didn't look like a mourner. He looked like someone who had been waiting in the rain for a very long time. "You're Evelyn, aren't you?" he asked. His voice was low, gravelly, with an accent I couldn't quite place. I nodded, my guard up instantly. "I worked with your father a long time ago, before the post office, before all of this." He gestured vaguely toward the church and the circus of cameras. He didn't offer a name, and he didn't offer a handshake. Instead, he reached into his pocket and pulled out a small, heavy object wrapped in a piece of yellowed parchment. He pressed it into my hand, his fingers cold against my palm. He told me that if the day came where they tried to bury the truth along with him, I should find you. He said you were the only one who knew how to look for the things that are hidden in plain sight. I looked down and unwrapped the paper. It was a tarnished brass key with a small plastic tag attached to it. On the tag, in my father's unmistakable, precise handwriting, was a locker number and the name of a train station in downtown Newark. When I looked up to ask him what it meant, the man was already moving away, disappearing into the crowd of black coats and umbrellas, leaving me standing there with the weight of a secret I wasn't yet sure I wanted to uncover. The key was cold in my pocket, a heavy, jagged piece of metal that felt like it was burning a hole through my coat as I watched the black SUVs disappear into the gray Pennsylvania mist. Looking at that key, I couldn't help but think about how my father, Art Vance, spent his entire life keeping track of things that were lost, and yet, sitting here today, I realized the biggest thing he ever lost was the truth of his own home. He was a man of the post office, logical, orderly, a believer in the sanctity of a seal, but the house I grew up in was built on a series of unaddressed envelopes and letters that were never meant to be opened. As I stood on the cathedral steps, the silence of the empty street felt like the silence that had lived between us for 40 years. It wasn't the kind of silence that comes from having nothing to say. It was the kind that comes when you're protecting a secret so fragile that even a whisper might shatter it. My father loved Eleanor with a quiet, desperate loyalty that blinded him to the way she was slowly erasing me from the narrative of our family. And it's only now, with this brass key in my hand, that I realize he might have been documenting his own disappearance alongside mine. The memory of the summer of 1982 has always felt like a faded photograph in my mind, one where the edges are curled and the colors are just a little too bright to be real. My father once told me, in a rare moment of vulnerability when he thought the scotch had dulled the edges of his memory, about the night he met Eleanor. It was a humid July evening at a VFW dance in Harrisburg. He was 31, a man who had already seen too much as a young postal inspector, and she was 26, glowing with a kind of desperate beauty that he mistook for vitality. She was already 3 months pregnant. She didn't have to tell him. He was a man who noticed the way a person carried themselves, the way a gait shifted to compensate for a new center of gravity. He knew. But Eleanor was terrified. A single woman in the early 80s with a scandal growing inside her, and Art was a man who looked at a broken thing and instinctively wanted to fix it. He married her 6 weeks later, a quick courthouse ceremony that felt more like a rescue mission than a wedding. I was born in February of 1983, a winter baby brought into a house that never quite felt warm enough. The math was there, staring everyone in the face, but in the Vance household, we didn't do that kind of arithmetic. We lived in the silence of the unspoken. My father treated me with a gentle, distant kindness, the way you treat a guest you're afraid might leave if you speak too loudly. But Eleanor looked at me and saw the ghost of a choice she wished she hadn't had to make. I grew up in the shadow of her resentment, a living, breathing reminder of the summer. Kyle Brennan vanished and left her with nothing but a secret. She never said it, of course. She was too refined for that. Instead, she used the architecture of our daily lives to build a wall between us. It was in the way she'd call me Evelyn with a sharp, clipped tone, while my sister Cynthia's name was always a melody. Cynthia arrived 4 years after me, and the shift in the house was instantaneous. It was like a light had been turned on in a room that had spent years in twilight. Cynthia was the perfect child, the one with Art's calm temperament and Eleanor's social ambition. From the moment she was brought home from the hospital, the landscape of our living room changed. The mantel, which had held a single, lonely photo of my first steps, was suddenly crowded with silver frames of Cynthia. Cynthia's first tooth. Cynthia's first day of preschool. Cynthia in a tutu. I became the background noise in my own life. I remember sitting on the stairs when I was maybe 7, watching them celebrate Cynthia's birthday. The house was full of laughter, and the smell of expensive cake, and Eleanor was glowing, holding Cynthia up like a trophy. My father was there, smiling, but I caught him looking at me once just for a second. There was a profound sadness in his eyes, a look of apology that he didn't have the words to voice. He knew the imbalance was there, but he was so grateful for the peace Eleanor provided that he couldn't bring himself to disrupt it. By the time I was a teenager, I had become an expert in invisibility. I learned to move through the hallways without making the floorboards creak. I learned to cook my own meals when Eleanor forgot I was coming home from track practice. I watched as Cynthia was enrolled in the best dance academies, bought the newest clothes, and encouraged to dream of Ivy League universities. When I made the dean's list, Eleanor would offer a tight, practiced smile and say, "That's nice, Evelyn. Now, could you help your sister with her history project? She's so stressed." It wasn't just that she loved Cynthia more. It was that she viewed Cynthia as her redemption. Cynthia was the daughter she was times supposed. Times to have. The one born into a proper marriage with a proper husband. I was just the preamble she wanted to skip over. The loneliness of those years wasn't a sharp pain. It was a dull ache, like a bone that had been broken and never quite set right. I retreated into my father's world, spending Saturday mornings at the post office, watching him sort the mail with a precision that bordered on the religious. He didn't talk much, but he'd let me sit on the high stool next to him, and occasionally he'd hand me an envelope with a blurred address. "What do you see, Eve?" he'd ask. I'd look at the ink, the postmark, the weight of the paper. "Someone was in a hurry," I'd say. He'd nod, a small, proud smile tugging at the corners of his mouth. Details. Never ignore the details. They're the only things that don't lie to you. It was our secret language, a bridge across the silence Eleanor had built between us. But even then, the isolation followed me home. I remember one Thanksgiving when I was 16. The house was filled with Eleanor's friends, the kind of people who wore cashmere and talked about their summer homes in the Poconos. Cynthia was the star of the evening, playing a Chopin nocturne on the piano, while everyone watched in rapt silence. I was in the kitchen, helping the hired caterers wash the dishes, because Eleanor had told them I was the neighbor's girl who needed some extra pocket money. She was so ashamed of the reality of me, of the timing of me, that she would rather lie to her closest friends than acknowledge my existence in that room. My father walked into the kitchen to grab a bottle of wine, and stopped when he saw me scrubbing a roasting pan. He looked at me, then at the closed dining room door where the laughter was loudest, and for a moment, the mask of the reliable postal inspector slipped. He reached out and squeezed my shoulder, his hand shaking slightly. "I'm sorry, Eve," he whispered. "I'm so sorry." That was the last time he ever apologized for her. After that, he seemed to retreat even further into himself, as if the weight of the lie was becoming too much to carry. He became the quiet man on the porch, the one who watched the world through the smoke of his pipe, while Eleanor and Cynthia built their empire of perfection on the foundation of his silence. I realized then that my father wasn't just an observer in that house. He was a prisoner of his own gratitude. He had spent 40 years paying a debt to a woman who had saved him from loneliness, and the currency he used was my erasure. Now, standing here with the key to a locker I didn't know existed, I wonder if he finally realized that some debts can never be paid in full, and some truths are too heavy to stay buried, even in a house built on silence. The doctor's office was too small for the four of us. Or maybe the air was just too heavy with the weight of what we were about to be told. It was a Tuesday, in August, the kind of humid Pennsylvania afternoon where the sky looks like a bruised plum, and I remember staring at a framed print of a lighthouse on the wall, wondering if the person who hung it knew that some storms don't give you a warning light. My father, Art Vance, sat in the center chair, his hands folded neatly in his lap like he was waiting for a bus that was running late. He looked smaller than I remembered, the sharp edges of his shoulders softening under his button-down shirt. When the oncologist, a man whose eyes looked like they had seen the end of the world too many times, said the words, "glioblastoma, multiforme, stage 4, the room didn't explode. It went silent. It was a cold, clinical silence that felt like it was freezing the blood in my veins. But as I reached out to grab my father's hand, I felt the shift in the room, not a shift of grief, but a shift of calculation. I looked at Eleanor and Cynthia, and for the first time in my life, I saw clearly that while I was mourning a man, they were already auditing an estate. My father's first reaction wasn't fear. It was a quiet, practical sort of confusion. He asked about the timeline, about the logistics of the VA benefits he'd earned over 40 years. But Eleanor didn't wait for the doctor to finish explaining the palliative options before she asked her first question. She didn't ask if he'd be in pain. She didn't ask about the quality of his remaining days. She leaned forward, her voice tight and precise, and asked, "How much of the private estate will be liquidated to cover the costs that the VA doesn't manage? We have property taxes coming up on the shore house, and I need to know the financial exposure." I remember the doctor pausing, his pen hovering over a notepad, looking at her with a flicker of disbelief. My father just stared at the floor, his jaw tightening. It was the sound of a woman counting the silverware while the house was still on fire. Cynthia was worse, though her brand of cruelty was wrapped in a more modern, digital veneer. She didn't talk about money, not out loud anyway. Instead, she pulled out her phone and started taking notes, her thumbs flying across the screen with a rhythmic clicking that sounded like a countdown. "This is so intense," she whispered, "not to us, but to the air. The struggle of a working-class hero against the ultimate clock. It's so raw." I watched her as she leaned in toward my father, not to hug him, but to get a better angle of his face in the harsh fluorescent light. She wasn't seeing her father, she was seeing a protagonist. She was seeing content. When we got back to the house, the atmosphere changed from a home to a boardroom. Eleanor spent that first evening in my father's office, not sitting with him on the porch, but going through the filing cabinets. I could hear the rustle of paper from down the hall, the sound of her verifying life insurance policies, and checking the balances on the CDs my father had spent a lifetime building for their retirement. I sat in the kitchen with Dad, making him a cup of tea he didn't want. He looked at me, his eyes clouded with a sudden, sharp lucidity. "Eve," he said, his voice barely a whisper, "I think the packages are starting to go missing. I can feel the loss already." I didn't know then if he was talking about his brain or his family, but I held his hand until his knuckles went white. The next few weeks were a descent into a specific kind of domestic hell. As the glioblastoma began to press against the parts of his brain that controlled language and memory, the seizures started. They were terrifying, violent tremors that left him exhausted and confused. I moved into the small guest room on the first floor to be near him, taking a leave of absence from my job at the warehouse. I became the person who managed the medication schedules, the person who cleaned up the spills, and the person who sat in the dark with him when he woke up screaming because he didn't know where he was. Eleanor avoided his room entirely. She claimed the smell of the antiseptic made her migraines flare up, so she spent her days on the phone with her bridge club friends, practicing her grieving widow voice. I'd overhear her in the sunroom, saying things like, "It's just so hard being the pillar of strength for this family. I have to manage the entire transition alone. Cynthia is so brave, she's documenting everything for posterity." It was a masterpiece of gaslighting. She was managing the transition by moving money between accounts while I was in the bathroom scrubbing vomit out of the rug. Cynthia, however, was always around, but never helpful. She'd drift into my father's room when he was at his most vulnerable, usually when the medication had left him in a state of sundowning confusion. He would wander through his memories, talking to people from his past, his voice thick and slurred. Instead of comforting him or trying to ground him, Cynthia would sit in the corner with a high-end digital recorder. I caught her once, leaning over him, while he was weeping about a lost mailbag from 1974. "Cynthia, what are you doing?" I asked, my voice trembling with suppressed rage. She didn't even look up, her eyes fixed on the levels on her recording app. "I'm capturing the texture of his decline, Evelyn. It's for the book. People need to hear the actual sound of a hero's mind unraveling. It's what makes the story sellable. You wouldn't understand, you're too close to it. He's your father, not a sound effect," I snapped, reaching for the recorder. She pulled it away, her face hardening into that expression of elite entitlement she'd perfected since preschool. "I'm the one making sure his legacy matters, Evelyn. While you're playing nursemaid, I'm building something that will outlast this disease. We need the money, or haven't you been listening to Mom? The treatment costs you're pushing for are draining the family's future. This book is our insurance policy." I realized then that they had reached a silent agreement. Eleanor would handle the liquidation of the past, and Cynthia would handle the monetization of the present. They were a two-woman demolition crew, and my father was just the structure they were tearing down for scrap metal. The most chilling moment came on a Tuesday night in late September. My father had had a particularly rough day, and he was drifting in and out of sleep. Eleanor walked into the room, not to check on him, but to ask me where the key to the safe deposit box was. I told her I didn't know, and she sighed, a sound of profound annoyance. She looked at my father, her husband of over 40 years, as if he were a piece of faulty machinery that was taking too long to break. "It's just so inefficient," she muttered, checking her watch. "The doctors said months. But at this rate, the private nursing fees will eat through the remaining equity in the Harrisburg property by Christmas. We need to start looking into the state-run facilities. The VA has a place in Lebanon that's adequate." "He's not going to a state-run facility, Eleanor," I said, my voice cold. "I'll pay for the home care myself if I have to." She looked at me with a pitying smile, the same one she used when I was 10, and asked for a new bike. "With what, Evelyn? Your warehouse wages? Be realistic. You're being emotional, and in a situation like this, emotion is a luxury we can't afford. We have to protect what's left." She walked out, leaving the door open, the light from the hallway spilling across my father's face. He opened his eyes then, just for a second. There was a spark of the old Art Vance there, the inspector who could spot a tampered seal from a mile away. He looked at the doorway where his wife had just stood, and then he looked at me. He didn't say a word, but he squeezed my hand with a strength I didn't know he had left. It was a warning. The storm wasn't just coming. It was already inside the house. And for the first time, I realized that my father wasn't just fighting a tumor. He was fighting to survive long enough to make sure that the people counting his money didn't get the last word. The sound of the Amtrak train huffing and screeching against the iron tracks at 4:30 a.m. has a way of stripping a person down to their barest self. In those pre-dawn hours, when the world is nothing but shadows and the smell of stale coffee, there is no room for pretension or the polished lies of a social media feed. I would sit there, my back aching from a double shift at the warehouse that had ended only 2 hours prior, watching the bluish light of the cabin reflect off my father's pale, sleeping face. Every mile we traveled toward the specialists in Philadelphia was a mile further into a debt that threatened to swallow me whole. To the world outside, the Vance family was a portrait of tragic grace, led by a grieving widow and a devoted, storytelling daughter. But the world didn't see the paperwork I signed in the dark, cashing out my $401k, selling my car, and draining every cent of the $190,000 required for the experimental trials that Eleanor and Cynthia had deemed a bad investment. They didn't see me counting quarters for the vending machine while I waited for his infusions to finish. They saw the story they wanted to believe, while I lived the reality they refused to touch. If you've ever been the one to sacrifice everything for family, only to be treated like an extra in your own life, you understand what Evelyn is feeling right now. Those cold night trains to Philadelphia didn't just carry her exhausted body, they carried a fragile flicker of hope. Don't go anywhere, because in just a moment, the true faces of the mother and younger sister will be exposed in a way you could never imagine. Don't forget to subscribe to the channel so you don't miss the moment justice is served. Let's continue. By the middle of October, my life had narrowed down to a single, grueling loop. My car was gone, sold to a local dealer for $3,000 less than it was worth, because I needed the cash by that Monday. I moved through my days in a state of perpetual vibration, fueled by cheap caffeine and the quiet, burning necessity of keeping Art Vance alive. The clinical trial at Penn Medicine was our last stand, a $190,000 gamble that the VA refused to cover. When I brought the paperwork to Eleanor, she didn't even put down her wine glass. She just looked at the total and laughed a short, sharp sound that felt like a slap. "We have to be stewards of the family legacy, Evelyn," she had said, her eyes cold as flint. "Spending that kind of money on a maybe is irresponsible to the survivors. We have a lifestyle to maintain." So, I became the steward of his life instead. I picked up a night shift at the shipping terminal, moving heavy crates until my knuckles bled and my knees felt like they were made of glass. I'd finish at 3:30 a.m., shower in the locker room, and walk straight to the station to catch the early train with Dad. Those 6-hour round trips were the only time we were truly together, away from the suffocating atmosphere of Eleanor's grieving house. Art would lean his head against the cold window pane, his eyes tracking the passing trees of the Pennsylvania countryside. In those moments, he wasn't the patient or the protagonist. He was just my father. "You're working too hard, Eve," he whispered one morning, his voice thick with the tumor's intrusion. "I can see the ghosts under your eyes." I squeezed his hand, the skin paper-thin and bruised from the constant blood draws. "I'm just doing the math, Dad. Just making sure the packages get delivered on time." He looked at me for a long time, a flash of that old, investigative sharpness returning to his gaze. "Eleanor thinks I don't hear her," he said quietly. "She thinks I don't hear her talking to the accountants in the hallway. But I hear everything, Eve. I hear the sound of people counting their chickens before they've even hatched." While we were navigating the grim reality of infusion rooms and the metallic taste of hospital food, back at the house, a different kind of work was being done. Cynthia had turned my father's illness into her full-time job, though she never actually touched a pill bottle or helped him into a wheelchair. I would come home, staggering with exhaustion, only to find a tripod set up in the living room or a professional photographer adjusting the lighting. Cynthia had mastered the art of the caregiver aesthetic. She would wait until the 15 minutes a day when Dad was lucid and dressed in a clean sweater, the one I had washed and ironed, and she would swoop in for a photo. I'll never forget the Tuesday we returned from a particularly brutal session of radiation. Dad was nauseous, his balance was off, and he just wanted to crawl into bed. As we crossed the threshold, Cynthia appeared, her hair perfectly curled, wearing a somber but elegant black dress. She didn't offer to take his bag. She didn't ask if he'd eaten. She pulled a small ring light out from behind the sofa. "Oh, Dad, you look so fragile and brave," she cooed, positioning herself next to his chair. "Hold this copy of the VA handbook. I want to talk about the weight of service in my next post." "He needs to lie down, Cynthia," I said, my voice cracking from the strain of holding him upright. "Just 1 second, Evelyn. Don't be so dramatic. This is for the book's social media campaign. People are already pre-ordering based on these updates. We have to keep the momentum going." She snapped a photo of herself staring soulfully into the camera while her hand rested lightly on Dad's shoulder. Later that night, I saw the post. Asterisk. "Today was a long day of fighting the shadows." Asterisk, she wrote to her 50,000 followers. Asterisk. "Watching my hero decline is the hardest thing I've ever done, but I refuse to leave his side. Being his sole support is a burden I carry with pride." Number. The last hero. Number caregiver life. Asterisk. The comment section was an outpouring of adoration. Asterisk. "You're such an inspiration, Cynthia. Your father is so lucky to have you. A true angel." Asterisk. I sat on the floor of the guest room, looking at my own bank balance, $42.18. I had just paid the facility fee for his next 3 treatments. I had no car, no savings left, and I was about to lose my apartment because I couldn't keep up with the rent. I felt like I was being erased in real time, my actual, physical labor being overwritten by her digital fiction. One evening, Eleanor walked into the kitchen while I was meal prepping Dad's soft foods for the week. She was wearing a new pearls, likely bought with the bridge loan she had taken out against the house. She stood there, watching me blend carrots and broth, a look of profound distaste on her face. "You're making a spectacle of yourself, Evelyn," she said calmly. "The way you run around working these menial jobs looking so unkempt. It reflects poorly on the family. If Cynthia can manage to find a book deal and a Netflix option to cover our future, surely you could find a way to contribute that doesn't involve looking like a martyr." "I am contributing, Eleanor," I said, not looking up from the blender. "I'm paying for the medicine that's keeping his heart beating. I'm the one on the train at 4 in the morning. And that was your choice," she snapped. "A sentimental, expensive choice. Art is 74. Nature has a path, and you're trying to pave it with gold we don't have. You think you're being the hero, but you're just being a nuisance. Cynthia is the one who will ensure we aren't left in poverty when he's gone. You should be thanking her." I didn't answer. I couldn't. If I had opened my mouth, I would have screamed until my lungs gave out. I just turned the blender on, the roar of the motor drowning out her voice, drowning out the sound of a family that had traded its soul for a better camera angle. That night, as I sat by Dad's bed, he reached out and grabbed my wrist. His grip was surprisingly strong. He looked toward the door to make sure we were alone, then leaned in close. "The train, Eve," he whispered. "The train isn't just for the medicine. It's for the truth. Don't let them take the tickets." I didn't understand what he meant then. I thought it was the glioblastoma talking, the confusion of a dying mind. But as I looked into his eyes, I saw a flicker of the man who had spent 40 years looking for the things people tried to hide in the mail. He knew. He was watching them, just as I was. And in the quiet of that room, while Cynthia's phone pings with likes and Eleanor's wine glass clinked in the parlor, a new kind of medicine started to take hold. Not the kind that cures a tumor, but the kind that prepares a man for a final, righteous strike. The smell of old paper and dust had always been my father's sanctuary, but by early November, that scent was replaced by the medicinal tang of home hospice care. It's funny how a person's entire world can shrink down to the size of a master bedroom, and yet, within those 4 walls, a betrayal can grow so large it threatens to pull the ceiling down on top of you. I remember that afternoon vividly. The light was a weak, watery gold, casting long shadows across the hallway carpet. I was in the kitchen, finally allowing myself 10 minutes to sit and stare at a bowl of cold soup. My ears tuned to the low hum of the oxygen concentrator in the other room. My father, Art Vance, had been having a good day, one of those rare spikes of lucidity that the doctors call the terminal rally. He had asked for his glasses and his favorite wool cardigan, the one I had painstakingly hand-washed because Eleanor refused to touch it. He looked like the man he used to be, the postal inspector who could spot a forged signature from across a room. But then the silence from his room changed. It wasn't the silence of sleep, but the heavy, vibrating silence of a man who has just seen his own life being stolen while he was still breathing it. I didn't hear him fall, but I heard the sharp, metallic clatter of Eleanor's iPad hitting the hardwood floor. I dropped my spoon and ran, my heart hammering against my ribs. I found him sitting on the edge of his bed, his face a ghostly, ashen gray that made my blood run cold. He was trembling so violently that the headboard was rattling against the wall. Eleanor's tablet lay face up on the rug, the screen glowing with a document that hadn't been meant for his eyes. It was an open PDF, a file labeled Times, The Last Hero, Final Manuscript Draft. Asterisk. Dad? Dad, talk to me. Is it a seizure? I scrambled toward him, reaching for his pulse, but he pushed my hand away with a strength that shocked me. He wasn't having a medical crisis, he was having a spiritual one. Evelyn, he whispered. And the way he said my name with a raw, jagged edge of heartbreak told me everything. They aren't just waiting for me to die. They've already buried me, and they've buried you with me. I picked up the tablet, my eyes scanning the pages as my father sat there gasping for air. It wasn't a memoir. It was a work of fiction masquerading as the truth. Cynthia had written 600 pages of a life that didn't exist. In the book, Cynthia was the one who had stayed awake for 48 hours straight during the first hospital stay. Cynthia was the one who had navigated the labyrinth of the VA system. Cynthia was the one who had sold her jewelry to pay for the immunotherapy in Philadelphia. I scrolled through the chapters, my hands shaking so hard I nearly dropped the device. My name Evelyn didn't appear once. Not in the childhood memories, not in the medical struggles, not in the acknowledgments. I was a ghost in my own family's history, a shadow that had been scrubbed clean from the narrative to make room for Cynthia's heroic solo journey. Look at page 42, my father said, his voice gaining a terrifying, low-octane clarity. I clicked through. It was a description of the train rides to Philadelphia. Cynthia had described the 4:30 a.m. mist, the smell of the Amtrak coffee, and the way the light hit my father's face as he slept against the window. She had taken my exhaustion, my 6-hour round trips, and my bleeding knuckles from the warehouse, and she had draped them over herself like a costume. She wrote about how she sat there counting her last few dollars to buy him a sandwich. She had even included a photo, the one she had snuck of him sleeping while I was in the train's bathroom trying to splash cold water on my face. But it wasn't just the theft of the story that broke him. It was the contract notes at the bottom of the file. Eleanor had left comments in the margins, reading to suggestions on how to make the Evelyn-shaped hole even larger. Asterisk. Make sure to emphasize that you were the only one there. Asterisk, Eleanor had written. Asterisk. If we mention her, the Netflix deal for the limited series drops by half. They want the sole caregiver angle. The $500,000 buyout depends on the purity of the sacrifice. Keep the narrative clean. Asterisk. $500,000. That was the price of my erasure. That was the value they had placed on my father's final months. They weren't just counting the money. They were actively engineering a reality where I had never existed, all to satisfy a production company's casting requirements. Art Vance sat up straighter then. The tremor in his hands didn't stop, but his eyes, those sharp, investigative eyes that had spent 40 years looking for the cracks in people's stories, became terrifyingly focused. He looked at the tablet as if it were a poisonous snake. I spent my life catching people who thought they were smarter than the system, Eve, he said, his voice cold and steady. People who thought they could swap one thing for another, and nobody would notice the difference. I didn't think I'd find those people in my own marriage bed. I didn't think I'd raise a thief. Dad, we can call them. We can stop this, I said, though even as the words left my mouth, I knew it was useless. Eleanor had the power of attorney over his estate. Cynthia had the media contacts. What did I have? A stack of warehouse pay stubs and a mountain of debt. He looked at me, and for the first time, he didn't look like a dying man. He looked like a man who was about to go undercover one last time. No, we don't call them. We don't say a word. If they want a hero's journey, we'll give them one. But it won't be the one they're writing. He leaned over and grabbed a pen from his bedside table, scrawling a series of numbers on the back of a prescription bottle. Call Julian. Use the old landline in the basement, the one Eleanor never uses. Tell him the registered mail has been tampered with. He'll know what it means." At that moment, the front door opened, and we heard the unmistakable chime of Eleanor's laughter, followed by the click of Cynthia's heels. They were home from a development lunch with a literary agent. I shoved the iPad back under the magazines on the nightstand just as they drifted into the room, smelling of expensive wine and success. "Oh, Art, you're awake. You look so expressive today," Cynthia chirped, immediately reaching into her bag for her phone. "Don't move. That shadow on your face is perfect. It looks like you're contemplating the infinite." I watched as she leaned over him, her face inches from his, adjusting her ring light. My father didn't flinch. He didn't pull away. He looked directly into her lens with a look of such profound, hidden contempt that I wondered how she didn't feel the air turn to ice. "You're doing a great job, Cynthia," he said, and the double meaning in his voice was so thick I could almost taste it. "You're making sure everyone gets exactly what they deserve." Eleanor smiled, patting his hand with her manicured fingers. "We're just making sure your story is told the right way, darling. For the legacy. For the girls." I stood in the corner, my hands balled into fists, watching the two women I had called family treat my father's bedroom like a movie set. I looked at the magazines covering the iPad, and then I looked at the prescription bottle in my hand with the secret numbers. The bang huang, the sheer, staggering shock of the betrayal was slowly being replaced by something else, a determination that felt like iron in my veins. My father was a man of the post office, a man who believed that every letter should reach its destination, and he was about to make sure that this final message, the real one, the one written in blood and sacrifice, was delivered with a signature that couldn't be forged. As I walked out of the room to find the basement phone, I heard Cynthia's voice behind me. "Stay just like that, Dad. The world is going to love you." I didn't turn around. I just kept walking. The world wasn't going to love the story Cynthia was telling, because my father was about to write the final chapter himself, and he was going to make sure the ink never dried. The air in the basement was damp and smelled of old newspapers, and the cedar chest where my father kept his service uniform, a scent that felt like the only honest thing left in that house. I sat on a milk crate in the shadows, staring at the old rotary phone on the wall, the one Eleanor had forgotten to disconnect years ago because she didn't think anything down here was worth her time. My heart was thumping a frantic rhythm against my ribs as I dialed the number my father had scrawled on the medicine bottle. I realized then that my father, Art Vance, wasn't just a dying man anymore. He was a man going back to work. For 40 years, he had tracked the things people tried to steal through the cracks in the system, and now, with the clock ticking down on his own life, he was turning those cold, investigative eyes on his own living room. He had seen the manuscript, he had seen the price tag on his own dignity, and he was about to prove that a veteran postal inspector is never more dangerous than when he has absolutely nothing left to lose. I heard the line click on the other end, followed by the gruff, familiar voice of Julian. "Vance? Is that the line?" He didn't say hello. He didn't ask how I was. Julian and my father had spent 3 decades in the trenches of the Postal Service together, and they had a shorthand that transcended social niceties. "It's Evelyn, Julian," I whispered, my eyes darting toward the basement stairs to make sure the door hadn't creaked open. "He told me to tell you. The registered mail has been tampered with. The seal is broken." There was a long, heavy silence on the other end. I could hear Julian take a slow drag of a cigarette. "I was afraid of that," he said, his voice dropping an octave. "I've been watching Cynthia's social media. The math didn't add up, Eve. I know who was on those trains to Philly. I know who's been at the bank. You tell Art I'll be there in an hour. Tell him the package is ready for pickup." When I went back upstairs, I found my father in a state that, to anyone else, would have looked like the final surrender. He was slumped in his recliner, his eyes half closed, his mouth slightly open. He looked frail, defeated, the very image of the unraveling hero Cynthia needed for her next chapter. Eleanor was in the kitchen, humming a tune as she poured herself a second glass of Chardonnay, likely already dreaming of the pool she'd install with the Netflix money. She glanced at him with a mix of pity and impatience, the way you look at a piece of fruit that stayed on the counter a day too long. "He's fading, isn't he, Evelyn?" she said, her voice devoid of any real grief. "It's probably for the best. The hospice nurse says the agitation usually gets worse toward the end. It would be a mercy if he just drifted off soon." I didn't answer. I walked over to Dad and adjusted the blanket, my hand grazing his shoulder. I felt a subtle, sharp pinch, a signal. When I looked into his eyes, they weren't glassy or vacant. Behind that mask of exhaustion, his mind was clicking with the precision of a Swiss watch. He was playing the part they had written for him, using their own arrogance as a blindfold. Julian arrived shortly after, carrying a small black bag that looked like it held plumbing tools. Eleanor barely looked up from her magazine. "Oh, Julian, Art isn't really up for visitors. He's quite confused today." "I just came to check the pipes in the master bath, Eleanor," Julian said, his face a mask of professional boredom. "Art mentioned a leak weeks ago. Don't want the floor rotting out, do we?" Eleanor waved him off with a manicured hand. "Fine, fine. Just be quiet. Cynthia is upstairs working on her final draft, and she needs her concentration." Once the door to the master bedroom was closed, the atmosphere shifted instantly. My father sat up, the confusion evaporating from his face like mist. Julian reached into his bag and pulled out a series of small, high-end digital recorders and a tiny camera lens no bigger than a shirt button. These weren't toys. They were the tools of the trade they had used back in the 90s to catch organized mail theft rings. "We need the receipts first, Eve," my father said, his voice low and commanding. "Every train ticket, every pharmacy bill you paid out of pocket, every warehouse pay stub. We need the physical proof that you were the one holding the line while they were at the spa. We're building a paper trail that even Eleanor's lawyers can't shred." For the next 2 hours, while Cynthia was upstairs writing about her solitary nights of caregiving, we were conducting a forensic audit of the last 7 months. I pulled out the shoebox I'd kept under my bed, filled with every scrap of paper that documented my bankruptcy. Julian photographed them one by one, cataloging them with the date and time. But the real work was the audio surveillance. Julian spent the afternoon discreetly installing the recorders, one behind the heavy oak dresser, one under the porch table where Eleanor took her private calls, and most importantly, one inside the velvet lining of the very recorder Cynthia used to capture his stories. "She thinks she's recording my memories," my father whispered, a grim smile touching his lips. "But from now on, she's going to be recording her own confession." Over the next week, the house became a theater of the absurd. I watched as my father perfected his performance. He would pretend to be asleep when Cynthia entered the room, waiting for her to lean in and whisper things like, "Hurry up and give me something good, Dad. The agent says we need more emotional angst for Chapter 22. Tell me about the pain." And then, when she thought he was lost in a fog, she would call Eleanor into the room and they would speak with a cold, clinical cruelty that made my skin crawl. One night, the recorder under the porch table captured a conversation that was the smoking gun. I was in the kitchen when I heard them outside. Eleanor's voice was sharp. "The lawyer says, if we can get him to sign the addendum to the Shore House deed now, it won't go through probate. We can list it next month. Cynthia, make sure you mention in the book that he times wanted times you to have it as a thank you for your sacrifices. It makes the transfer look sentimental rather than financial." "Got it, Mom," Cynthia replied, the sound of her sipping a drink audible on the tape. "I've already written the scene. It's beautiful. I cry while he hands me the keys. It'll be the centerpiece of the Netflix trailer." My father sat in his room, wearing headphones connected to the receiver, listening to his wife and daughter plan the liquidation of his life's work. He didn't cry. He didn't rage. He simply picked up a notepad and began to write down the timestamps, his hands steady and sure. He was cataloging their betrayals with the same meticulous care he had once used to document federal crimes. "They think I'm the victim in their story, Eve," he said to me that night, as I sat by his bed. He looked out the window at the dark Pennsylvania woods. "They think the hero is the one with the microphone and the book deal. But they forgot the first rule of the post office. The most important part of the letter isn't what's written on the outside. It's what's hidden inside the envelope." He reached out and squeezed my hand, and for the first time in months, I felt a flicker of real hope. It wasn't the hope of a cure. We both knew the tumor was winning that battle, but it was the hope of a reckoning. My father was a man who spent his life making sure that things were delivered to the right people. And he was making sure that his final delivery would be the one thing Eleanor and Cynthia never saw coming. The truth, signed, sealed, and delivered in front of the whole world. The house was deathly quiet that night. the kind of heavy, pressurized stillness that settles over a place just before a massive storm breaks. Outside, the Pennsylvania trees were skeletal against a jagged moon, and the only sound in the hallway was the rhythmic, mechanical wheeze of the oxygen concentrator in my father's room. I was sitting on the floor in the kitchen, leaning my head against the cold metal of the refrigerator, trying to remember what it felt like to not be tired. My bank account was overdrawn, my car was long gone, and I was living in a ghost version of my own life. I looked at the dark hallway leading to the master bedroom where Eleanor and Cynthia were likely sleeping, dreaming of red carpets and book tours built on the bones of my exhaustion. For 40 years, I had accepted my role as the mistake, the obligation, the shadow in the corner of their perfect family portraits. I thought I knew the hierarchy of this house. I thought I knew who belonged, and who was merely tolerated. But that night, as the clock ticked past 2:00 a.m., my father signaled me into his room with a flicker of his bedside lamp, a quiet call to arms that would dismantle every lie I had ever been told about the blood in my veins. I know that sometimes in this life, we choose to remain silent not because we are weak, but because we hope that love will eventually win over a person's heart. But for Art Vance, his silence was a weapon. Have any of you watching this ever felt completely invisible in your own home? Have you ever had your hard work and your sacrifices snatched away by the very people you called your own flesh and blood? I understand that pain deeply, and this story is my promise to you. The truth, no matter how deeply it's buried, will always find its way to the light. Let's go back to that room. My father was propped up on his pillows, his face illuminated by the soft, amber glow of a single reading lamp. He looked incredibly frail, his skin almost translucent, but his eyes were burning with a terrifying, lucid intensity. He didn't look like a man at the end of his journey. He looked like a man who had finally reached the podium to deliver a verdict. He reached under his mattress and pulled out a thick, manila envelope, the edges worn and the seal reinforced with heavy-duty postal tape. He held it out to me, his hand steady for the first time in weeks. "Open it, Eve," he whispered, his voice vibrating with a hidden strength. "I've spent 40 years protecting the wrong people. It's time I protected the only one who actually stayed." I took the envelope, my heart thumping against my ribs so loudly I could hear it in my ears. Inside was a collection of documents that felt like they were made of lead. There were birth certificates, old letters from a woman named Sarah, and a private investigator's report from 1982. My eyes scanned the first page, and the world began to tilt on its axis. "Everyone told you that you were the mistake, Eve," my father said, his gaze fixed on mine. "Eleanor made sure you grew up believing I married her to save you from being fatherless. She used that guilt to keep you in the shadows, to make you feel like you owed her your very existence. But the math they gave you was a lie." I looked at the birth certificate. It wasn't a standard copy. It was a restricted filing. My father's name was listed as the biological father, but the mother wasn't Eleanor. It was Sarah Miller, a woman I had never heard of. "I loved Sarah," Art said, a soft, grieving smile touching his lips. "We were supposed to get married, but Eleanor, she was the daughter of the regional postmaster back then. She wanted the life I could provide, the stability. When Sarah got pregnant with you, Eleanor didn't just walk away. She used her father's influence to threaten Sarah, to drive her out of town while I was away on a federal audit. By the time I got back, Sarah was gone, and Eleanor was waiting with a story about how Sarah had abandoned me for someone else. I felt the air leave my lungs. All those years of being told I was the mercy child, the one Art took in out of the goodness of his heart to cover Eleanor's supposed shame. She found out Sarah had died in childbirth. Art continued, his voice dropping to a jagged whisper. She showed up at the hospital, intercepted the records, and told me that Sarah had left me a child before she passed. But Eleanor made a deal. She said she'd raise you as her own, that she'd keep the secret of your shameful birth, but only if I married her and never spoke Sarah's name again. I was young, I was grieving, and I wanted my daughter. So I signed her contract. I let her rewrite your history to make herself the hero." He reached out and turned the page for me. It was a DNA test from 10 years ago, one I never knew he'd taken. But here's the part she doesn't know I know, Eve. The part that kept me awake every night while she was out at her gala dinners. He pointed to a second set of results. They belonged to Cynthia. Eleanor was so busy making sure you felt like an outsider that she forgot I was a trained investigator. I started noticing things about Cynthia, the way she looked, her blood type, the timing of her birth after one of Eleanor's long charity trips to New York. I took a sample of her hair from a brush years ago. Cynthia isn't mine, Eve. She's the result of an affair Eleanor had with a developer in Manhattan. The golden child. The one with the blue eyes and the perfect pedigree. She's the one who doesn't belong to this bloodline. The irony was so thick, it was suffocating. The woman who had erased me, the woman who was currently selling a book about her heroic father to Netflix, was the only person in the house with no biological link to the man she was exploiting. All those years of being told Cynthia was the real daughter, the one who took after him, while I was the mistake who should be grateful for the crumbs. She built this entire house on a foundation of theft. Eve, my father said, his hand tightening on mine. She stole you from Sarah. She stole Sarah's place in my life. And now she and Cynthia are trying to steal your story, your sacrifice, and my death to fund a lifestyle they didn't earn. They think they've won because they have the microphones and the camera crews. They think because you're broke and tired, you've lost. He leaned in closer, the scent of antiseptic and old paper surrounding us. But they've made the classic mistake of a thief. They assumed the person they were robbing wasn't keeping a ledger. I looked at the documents, then at my father. The bang huang, the staggering shock, was being replaced by a cold, crystalline clarity. I wasn't the guest in this family. I was the heir. The woman upstairs, sleeping in silk sheets bought with my father's salary, was the interloper. The girl writing a 600-page lie was a stranger to the man she called Dad. Julian has the originals in a safe deposit box, Art whispered. The video we're making, it's not just about the caregivers, Eve. It's about the blood. It's about the 40 years of interest I'm about to collect on their lies. I stood up, holding the envelope to my chest. I looked toward the door, imagining Eleanor and Cynthia in their beds, so confident in their victory, so sure that I was just the neighbor's girl who was too dramatic for her own good. My father watched me, a flicker of his old investigative pride returning to his face. "Go to sleep, Eve," he said softly. "You've spent enough nights being the ghost. Tomorrow, we start making sure they're the ones who disappear." I walked back to my room in the dark, but I didn't feel invisible anymore. I felt like a landslide that was just beginning to move. The math finally added up, and for the first time in 43 years, I knew exactly who I was. I was Evelyn Vance. I was Art's daughter. And I was the storm that was about to blow their house of glass to the ground. There is a specific kind of light that fills a room when a life is preparing to slip away, a soft amber glow that makes everything look more precious and more fragile than it actually is. In those final days of November, my father's bedroom became a sanctuary of shadows and heavy, labored breaths, a place where time didn't move in hours, but in the slow, rhythmic beat of a fading heart. I sat by his side in the dimness, my fingers tracing the worn edges of his old postal service manual, listening to the hum of the oxygen machine that had become the soundtrack of my existence. He had slipped into a deep coma 48 hours ago, his face finally smooth and free from the grimace of the glioblastoma's touch. It was peaceful, in a way that felt almost holy, but the peace only existed within the four walls of that room. Outside that door, in the brightly lit hallway, and the sun-drenched kitchen, a different kind of energy was pulsing. It was the sound of planners and opportunists, the sharp clink of wine glasses celebrating a victory that hadn't even officially arrived yet. While I was holding my father's hand, feeling the warmth slowly retreat from his skin, Eleanor and Cynthia were already measuring the drapes for a life without him, treating his final breaths like the starting gun for a race they had been preparing to run for 40 years. The house had taken on a dual reality. In the master bedroom, it was a tomb. In the rest of the house, it was a headquarters. I spent my nights curled in the armchair next to Dad's hospice bed, my eyes burning from a combination of exhaustion and the stinging scent of antiseptic. I was broke, truly, deeply broke. My last warehouse check had gone toward a private nurse for the few hours I needed to sleep, and my credit cards were maxed out from the sheer weight of the Philadelphia trips. I was a ghost in a worn-out flannel shirt, drifting through a house that felt increasingly like a stage set. Every time I stepped out of Dad's room to get a glass of water, I felt the shift in atmosphere. The air in the living room was charged with a clinical, predatory excitement that made my stomach turn. Eleanor had stopped pretending to be the grieving wife. She was now the CEO of the Vance estate. I walked into the kitchen on a Thursday afternoon to find her and Cynthia surrounded by folders, architectural drawings, and a bottle of expensive champagne that was chilling in a silver bucket. They didn't even stop talking when I entered. They had reached a level of arrogance where they no longer felt the need to hide their intentions from the neighbor's girl. If we list the shore house by January, we avoid the peak of the winter lull, Eleanor was saying, her pen circling a figure on a spreadsheet. The appraisal came back at $950. With the Netflix option money, we can buy that condo in Boca Raton outright. No mortgage, no baggage. Cynthia was leaning over her laptop, her eyes bright with a feverish glow. And the book launch has to be timed with the memorial service, Mom. The publicist says the grieving daughter angle is at its peak engagement within 14 days of the passing. If we wait longer, the news cycle moves on to the next tragedy. I've already drafted the "he's gone" post. I just need to plug in the final date. I stood by the sink, my hand trembling as I filled a glass with water. "He's still breathing, Cynthia," I said, my voice sounding thin and hollow even to my own ears. "He's in the other room, and he's still here." Cynthia didn't even look up from her screen. She just let out a long theatrical sigh. "Oh, Evelyn, don't be so morbidly literal. We're being practical. Unlike you, we have a future to secure. We can't all just sit in the dark and wait for the inevitable. Some of us have responsibilities to the legacy." Eleanor glanced at me, her eyes sweeping over my stained shirt and the dark circles under my eyes with a look of profound disgust. "And speaking of responsibilities, Evelyn, I hope you've made arrangements for your own housing. Once Art passes, this house will be cleared for staging within 72 hours. I won't have you cluttering up the place with your drama. You've spent his entire illness playing the martyr, and frankly, it's been exhausting for all of us." "I spent his illness keeping him alive," I snapped, the water in my glass sloshing over the rim. "I spent every dollar I had on the treatments you refused to pay for." Cynthia let out a sharp, mocking laugh. "And look where it got you, Eve. You're 6 figures in debt, you have no car, and your heroic efforts didn't change a thing. He's still dying, and you're just poor. It's almost funny, isn't it? You tried so hard to be the favorite, and all you did was bankrupted yourself for a man who's going to leave everything to the people who actually know how to manage a brand." "You're monsters," I whispered, the word feeling too small for the depth of the betrayal. Eleanor just smiled, a cold, practiced expression that reached nowhere near her eyes. "No, Evelyn, we're survivors. Your father understood that. He married me because he needed a woman who could hold a line, not a girl who cries over every spilled bottle of medicine. Now, go back in there and sit in the dark. Let us handle the real world." I retreated back into the silence of my father's room, the door clicking shut behind me like a shield. I sat down in the armchair and looked at Dad. His breathing was shallow now, a soft, raspy sound that felt like sandpaper on my heart. I reached out and took his hand, the skin so thin I could see the map of his veins beneath. I felt a sudden, sharp surge of grief, not just for his coming death, but for the 40 years he had spent tied to those women. He had known, hadn't he? Behind those investigative eyes, he had seen the calculation in Eleanor's heart every single day. He had stayed for me. He had endured the silence and the coldness, just to make sure I had a roof over my head until I was old enough to stand on my own. And now, he was giving me one last gift. I looked at the small digital recorder Julian had hidden behind the heavy oak dresser. It was a tiny, blinking red light in the darkness, a silent witness to the conversations happening just a few feet away. I knew what was on those tapes. I knew the sound of Eleanor laughing about my debt. I knew the sound of Cynthia practicing her fake sob for the Netflix cameras. It was all there, the contrast between the light and the dark, the truth and the lie. A few hours later, the sun began to set, casting long purple shadows across the room. I felt a change in the air, a stillness that was different from the coma. I leaned in close to my father's ear. "It's okay, Dad," I whispered, my voice breaking. "Julian has the envelope. The tickets are all accounted for. You can go now. I've got the ledger from here." I felt a faint, almost imperceptible squeeze from his hand, a final, ghostly signature on a life of service. And then, the room went completely silent. The oxygen machine continued to hum, but the rhythm of the house had shifted. Art Vance was gone. I didn't scream. I didn't run out to tell them. I just sat there in the amber light, holding the hand of the man who had truly loved me, while in the other room I heard the muffled pop of a champagne cork and the sound of my sister laughing. The light was dying, but for the first time in 43 years, I wasn't afraid of the dark. I knew that when the sun came up, the light wouldn't just be amber. It would be white and hot, and it would burn through every lie they had ever told. I sat there for a long time, the sole guardian of the truth, waiting for the world to wake up to the reckoning that was already signed, sealed, and waiting to be delivered. The air inside St. Jude's Cathedral was so cold, it felt like it was made of glass, fragile and sharp enough to cut. I sat in the very last row, just as I had during the rehearsal, watching the local news crews adjust their white balances, and the photographers squat in the aisles to get the best angle of Eleanor's mourning veil. It was a high-stakes production, a grand finale for a man who had lived his life in the quiet hum of a post office. But to the two women in the front pew, my father's casket was nothing more than a pedestal for their upcoming book launch. I looked down at my hands, still rough from the warehouse, and felt the weight of the digital drive in my pocket. For 7 months, I had been the ghost haunting the halls of my own life, the one who paid the bills in silence and changed the linens in the dark while they calculated the profit margins of a death that hadn't even happened yet. But as the organist began the opening hymn, a slow, mournful tune that felt heavy with the scent of lilies and lies, I knew that the silence was about to end. My father, Art Vance, had always been a man of the record, and today he was going to make sure the final entry was written in the cold, hard ink of the truth. The service moved with a terrifying, rehearsed efficiency. Eleanor gave a brief, dry-eyed statement about her 4 decades of devoted marriage, her voice perfectly modulated for the microphones. Then came Cynthia. She walked to the pulpit with a slow, rhythmic grace, her black silk dress whispering against the stone floor. She looked like a saint in mourning, clutching a copy of her manuscript to her chest, as if it were the only thing keeping her upright. She began to speak, and I felt a physical wave of nausea as she launched into a story about the rainy nights in Philadelphia, about the lonely vigils she had kept by Art's bedside, and the crushing financial weight she had carried alone to fund his final hope. She even paused for a sob, a perfect 3-second catch in her throat that prompted a ripple of sympathetic whispers from the pews. It was a masterpiece of theft. She was wearing my life like a costume, selling my sacrifices to a room full of strangers while I sat in the shadows of the back row, erased and forgotten. As Cynthia reached the crescendo of her eulogy, talking about how Art's final words were a blessing for her unwavering loyalty, a light scattered of applause actually broke out in the front rows. It was the moment she had been waiting for, the standing ovation that would launch her Netflix deal. But then Julian stood up. He didn't look like a hero. He looked like a retired postal worker in a slightly ill-fitting suit, walking toward the altar with a steady, purposeful gait. He didn't ask for permission. He simply walked to the AV console where the church's young technician was sitting, and with a nod that only I could see, he took over the system. Art Vance was a man who believed in the integrity of the seal. Julian's voice boomed through the speakers, cutting through Cynthia's practiced whimpering. He believed that a message should be delivered exactly as it was written, and he left me one last package to deliver to all of you. Cynthia's face went pale, her hand gripping the edge of the pulpit so hard her knuckles turned white. "Julian, this is highly inappropriate," Eleanor hissed from the front row, standing up to intervene. "This is a time for family, not for this." "Sit down, Eleanor," Julian said, his voice as cold as a winter morning in the Allegheny Mountains. "Art wanted everyone to see this, and you're going to want to hear what he has to say." He pressed a button, and the giant digital screens that had been displaying airbrushed photos of Cynthia and Art suddenly flickered to life. The church went so silent you could hear the flickering of the votive candles. It wasn't a polished slideshow. It was a raw, handheld video of my father sitting in his recliner, his eyes sharp and lucid, his voice steady with the authority of a man who had spent 40 years uncovering fraud. "My name is Art Vance," my father's image said, his voice echoing through the vaulted ceiling of the cathedral. "And if you're watching this, it means I'm finally out of the way, and the people I lived with are likely telling you a story that isn't true. I spent my life as an inspector, looking for the things that didn't match. And today, I'm here to audit my own death. The congregation gasped as the video transitioned into a split screen. On one side was a scan of a hospital bill, $19,000 for a single infusion. On the other side, a copy of my warehouse pay stub and the cashed-out 401k statement. "This is my daughter Evelyn's ledger," Art's voice continued, cold and precise. "She paid every cent. She worked the night shifts. She took 36 trains to Philadelphia while I slept on her shoulder. She spent $190,000 to buy me 7 months of life, and she did it while she was being told she was a mistake." Then the image changed. It showed Cynthia's Instagram grid, a series of staged photos in the hospital, time-stamped and dated. "Now, look at the visitor logs," Art said. The screen showed the hospital security records. Cynthia visited 12 times. Total time, 15 hours. Average stay, 75 minutes. Most of that time was spent adjusting her ring light. A murmur of shock rippled through the pews. I saw the reporter from the local paper lean forward, her pen flying across her notepad. Cynthia looked like she was about to collapse, her mouth hanging open as she watched her own fraud being dismantled by a dead man. But my father wasn't finished. "And then there's the book," Art's voice hardened. "The story of my last hero. I read the manuscript, Cynthia. I read about how times you times paid the bills. I read about how times you times rode those trains. You didn't just lie to your readers. You stole your sister's life because you thought she was too tired to fight back. You thought because she had debt and no microphone, she didn't have a voice. But I am her voice today." The screen flickered one last time, and then the audio began to play the secret recordings Julian had planted. It was Eleanor's voice, clear and sharp, talking about the Evelyn-shaped hole in the narrative and laughing about how my debt would keep me quiet. Then came Cynthia, talking about the $500,000 Netflix buyout and how they needed to keep the narrative clean by erasing me entirely. The church was paralyzed. Eleanor had sunk back into her seat, her face a mask of frozen horror. Cynthia was sobbing now, but it wasn't the beautiful, practiced sob from before. It was the raw, ugly sound of a cornered animal. The standing ovation she had received minutes ago felt like a distant, shameful memory. "Blood doesn't make a family," my father's image said, his eyes looking directly into the camera, directly at the front row. "Sacrifice does. Truth does. Evelyn is my daughter, in every way that matters. And to the rest of you, the postage is due, and I've made sure the bill is going to be very, very expensive." The screen went black. The silence that followed was absolute, a heavy, suffocating weight that lasted for what felt like an eternity. Then, a single person in the middle row, one of the postal workers who had served with my father for 30 years, stood up and began to clap. Then, another, and another. Within seconds, the cathedral was filled with a thunderous, rhythmic applause that wasn't for the widow or the author. It was for the truth. It was for me. I stood up, my legs shaking but my heart finally still. I didn't look at Eleanor, who was trying to shield her face from the cameras. I didn't look at Cynthia, who had fled the pulpit in disgrace. I walked down the center aisle, past the reporters and the stunned neighbors, toward the casket. I placed my hand on the wood, feeling the cold grain beneath my fingers. "Package delivered, Dad," I whispered. As I walked out of those heavy oak doors and into the biting Pennsylvania air, I heard the news crews shouting questions at Eleanor, the sound of the world finally waking up to the story they had tried so hard to bury. The thunder of justice was still ringing in my ears, and for the first time in 43 years I didn't feel like a ghost. I felt like the only person in that city who was truly, finally, alive. The sound of the cathedral doors closing behind me was the loudest thing I had ever heard. It wasn't just the thud of heavy oak meeting stone. It was the sound of a 43-year-old prison door finally locking from the outside. Behind me, the world was exploding in a frantic chaos of camera flashes and whispered scandals. But ahead of me, the Pennsylvania air was sharp and cold, smelling of damp earth and coming snow. I took a breath, a real breath, for the first time in 7 months. I had walked into that church, a ghost, a debt-ridden daughter whose name had been scrubbed from her own father's history. I walked out as the woman who had delivered Art Vance's final verdict. I knew that by the time the evening news aired, The house of glass Eleanor and Cynthia had built wouldn't just be cracked, it would be dust. They had spent years perfecting a version of reality where they were the stars and I was the smudge on the lens. But they had forgotten one fundamental truth that my father lived by. The post office always keeps a log. You can try to redirect a letter. You can try to forge a signature. But eventually, the missing package is found. And the person who stole it has to face the weight of the law. As I walked toward Julian's waiting car, I didn't feel a sense of triumph. Not yet. I felt a profound, heavy stillness. The fallout was just beginning, and for Eleanor and Cynthia, the nightmare was no longer something they could edit out. The speed at which their world disintegrated was almost terrifying. In the age of the internet, a scandal like this doesn't just simmer, it boils over in seconds. By the time I reached the small, quiet apartment I was barely keeping, the video from the funeral had already hit the local news feeds. The headline on the Harrisburg Gazette's website changed within the hour from "Local author honors veteran father" to "Video evidence exposes massive fraud in Vance Memorial." I sat at my kitchen table, watching my phone vibrate with notifications I couldn't bring myself to answer. It was a digital landslide. The reporters who had been so eager to interview Cynthia about her spiritual journey were now camping out on Eleanor's front lawn, but they weren't looking for a story about grief anymore. They were looking for blood. The first domino to fall was Berkshire House Publishing. I received an email from an old contact of Julian's who worked in the industry, telling me that the senior editor had seen the funeral video before the wake was even over. By 5:00 p.m., they had issued a formal statement. They were invoking the morality clause in Cynthia's contract, effective immediately. They didn't just cancel the book. They demanded the return of the first $85,000 advance payment within 30 days. I knew Cynthia had already spent nearly half of that on a designer wardrobe for the book tour and a PR firm to boost her Instagram following. The money was gone, and the debt was now hers. But the real blow came from Cascade Productions, the Netflix-backed company that had optioned the film rights. They didn't just withdraw their $125,000 offer. They filed a preliminary lawsuit for fraud and unjust enrichment. They argued that Cynthia had sold them an exclusive true story that was, in fact, a documented theft of my intellectual property and my lived experience. The golden child who had laughed at my $146,000 debt was now staring at a legal and financial abyss that made my struggles look like petty cash. I went to my father's house 2 days later to collect my remaining things. The atmosphere was unrecognizable. The polished, perfect sanctuary Eleanor had maintained was gone. The flower arrangements from the funeral were wilting on the porch, and the curtains were drawn tight. When I let myself in, I found Eleanor sitting in the dark of the sunroom, a half-empty bottle of Chardonnay on the table, and a stack of legal documents in her lap. She looked older, her skin sallow, and her hair, unkempt, the mask of the grieving widow, had finally melted away, leaving only the bitter, terrified woman beneath. "You think you've won, don't you, Evelyn?" she said, her voice jagged and thin. "You think destroying this family's reputation is going to bring him back? You've made us pariahs. Cynthia can't even go to the grocery store without people recording her on their phones, calling her a thief." "I didn't destroy anything, Eleanor," I said, picking up a box of my old books. "Art did. He just asked me to press play. He saw what you were doing. He heard you counting his money while I was changing his bandages. You shouldn't have underestimated a man who spent 40 years catching people like you." "He was confused," she shrieked, standing up so fast her chair scraped harshly against the floor. The tumor had rotted his mind. "That video, it's not legal. I'm the executor of the estate. I'll have it thrown out. I'll have Julian arrested for elder abuse." I looked at her with a pity that surprised me. Julian didn't just record a video, Eleanor. He had Art's primary oncologist and his attorney present when he signed the new will. They certified his mental capacity. "You aren't the executor anymore." She went silent then, her face turning a ghostly shade of white. I watched as she realized that the morality clause wasn't just in Cynthia's book contract. It was in the deed to her own life. Art had updated his will on February 12th, and he had included a very specific disinheritance clause regarding marital misconduct and the exploitation of his illness. Because Eleanor had been caught on tape conspiring to erase his biological heir and monetize his death, she had triggered a legal forfeiture. The house, the life insurance, and the $320,000 in savings weren't hers. They were mine. The perfect play that Eleanor and Cynthia spent months crafting is starting to crumble into pieces. But this is only the beginning of the fury from my late father. The most shocking truth about the Vance family bloodline is about to be revealed in the coming moments. Stay with me for a few more minutes to witness the ending that these betrayers truly deserve. You can subscribe to the channel to support the moral values we are protecting together. Cynthia came downstairs then, her eyes red and swollen from crying. She didn't look like a top-producing real estate agent anymore. She looked like a spoiled child who had finally been told no. She held her phone out to me, the screen filled with thousands of hateful comments on her Instagram. "They're calling for my license to be revoked, Evelyn," she whispered, her voice trembling. "They're saying I'm a fraud." Brian's parents called. "They're taking the kids to the Poconos until the scandal blows over. Brian won't even look at me." "You sold a story that wasn't yours, Cynthia," I said, looking her directly in the eyes. "You took the nights I spent crying on that train, and you tried to turn them into a movie deal. You didn't just lie to the world. You tried to steal my father's love for me and put your own name on it. Did you really think he wouldn't notice? We were going to share the money," she cried. A final, desperate lie. "No, you weren't," I said. "I heard the tapes. I heard you say I was dramatic, and that I had debt, and that nobody would believe me. You bet everything on the idea that I was too weak to stand up. You lost that bet." I walked out of the house for the last time that afternoon. As I stood on the sidewalk, I saw the Keller Williams sign in the neighbor's yard, and I thought about how much Cynthia loved her prestige. Within a week, her real estate license was suspended pending an investigation into unethical conduct. Within a month, her husband filed for divorce, citing an irretrievable breakdown of trust. Their empire of vanity was being dismantled by the very truth they had tried to bury. I looked up at the gray sky, feeling the first few flakes of snow on my face. The house was quiet now, no longer a stage set, just a building full of ghosts. My father had spent his life delivering the mail, making sure every letter found its way home. And as I drove away, I knew that the final package, the one containing the truth about who he loved and who we actually were, had finally been delivered. The postage had been paid in full, and the signature on the receipt was mine. The wood-paneled walls of the Dauphin County Courthouse felt cold, but for the first time in my life, I didn't feel small within them. For 43 years, I had walked through the world with my shoulders hunched, carrying the invisible weight of being a mistake and an outsider in my own home. I had believed the lies Eleanor fed me, like slow-acting poison, convinced that my only value lay in how much I could sacrifice without complaining. But as I sat at the plaintiff's table, watching the sunlight catch the dust motes dancing in the air, I realized that the man who had truly loved me, the man I called Dad, had spent his final, agonizing months building a fortress of truth for me to stand in. Justice, I've learned, doesn't always look like a Hollywood ending. Sometimes it looks like a thick stack of bank statements, a grainy video file, and the quiet, trembling hands of a woman who finally knows she was enough. My father had spent his career as an inspector, chasing down those who thought they could manipulate the system for a quick profit. And now, even from the grave, he was conducting one final investigation. The papers before me weren't just legal documents. They were the tickets back to my own life, and the woman sitting across the aisle, clutching her designer handbag like a life raft, was about to find out that some debts can never be settled with a fake smile or a polished Instagram caption. The legal battle didn't drag on as long as I expected, mostly because Art Vance was a man who left no room for interpretation. My attorney, Rebecca Stone, a woman with a sharp mind and a steady voice, called it the most airtight case of her career. We weren't just fighting over a house or a bank account. We were litigating the theft of a human experience. When the discovery phase opened, Eleanor and Cynthia's defense tried to lean into the narrative of family confusion. They tried to argue that the video was the product of a dying man's delirium, fueled by my manipulation and Julian's bitterness. But then Rebecca started laying out the evidence, piece by grueling piece, and the room went silent. She presented the medical logs from the VA, alongside my Amtrak ticket stubs. She showed the bank transfers from my meager savings account next to Cynthia's credit card statements from that same period, showing thousands spent on spa retreats and promotional photography while I was buying generic brand gauzy for dad stories. But the turning point, the moment that truly broke the spine of their defense, was the audio recordings. Hearing Eleanor's voice through the high-quality courtroom speakers, talking about me as if I were a stray dog that had stayed too long, was a surreal experience. Her laughter, so brittle and cold, echoed through the chamber, stripped of the perfect mother mask she had worn for 4 decades. I looked over at her, and for the first time, I didn't see a monster. I just saw a hollow, frightened woman who had traded her soul for the appearance of prestige, only to find that the currency she used was counterfeit. The evidence is overwhelming, the judge stated on the 3rd day of the hearing, his eyes fixed on Eleanor and Cynthia with a look of profound distaste. This was not a simple family disagreement. This was a calculated, multi-layered effort to defraud an estate and exploit the terminal illness of a veteran for commercial gain. More importantly, it was a systemic attempt to erase a biological heir's contribution and identity. When the final judgment was read, the room felt like it had been scrubbed clean. Eleanor was stripped of her status as executor. The morality clause Art had inserted into the updated will was upheld, triggering a total forfeiture of her marital share due to documented conspiracy and financial exploitation. The house in Harrisburg, the life insurance policy totaling $320,000, and the remaining savings were all transferred to me. But the most significant part was the settlement for unjust enrichment and defamation. Cynthia was ordered to pay back every cent of the book advance and the Netflix option, totaling over $210,000, plus an additional $186,000 to reimburse me for the medical expenses I had covered. In total, with punitive damages, the judgment against them surpassed $500,000. I watched Cynthia as the gavel struck. She didn't look like the star of a limited series anymore. She looked like a ghost. Her real estate license had already been suspended, her social circles had evaporated, and now her bank accounts were being frozen. She looked at me, her eyes red and pleading, but there was no apology in them, only the shock that she had actually been caught. She had lived her life believing that as long as the photo was pretty, the truth didn't matter. She was finding out that reality doesn't care about your lighting or your followers. Leaving the courthouse that day, I felt a strange sense of lightness. I didn't feel rich. I felt settled. I took the first payment from the liquidated estate and did the 2 things I had dreamt of doing since August. I called my friend Pauline and paid back every dollar she had lent me. With interest, she tried to refuse. Then, I sat at my kitchen table and spent 3 hours systematically paying off the personal loans and the credit cards I had maxed out to keep Dad in the Philadelphia trial. Watching those balances drop to 0 was a religious experience. The $146,000 debt that had felt like a noose around my neck was gone, replaced by a deep, resonant peace. But the most important part of the justice wasn't the money. It was fulfilling the hidden part of Art's will. My father had left me a set of instructions in that manila envelope, things he wanted done once the postage was paid. He wanted his legacy to belong to the people who stayed, not the people who performed. Following his wishes, I began the process of setting up the Art Vance Memorial Fund. I didn't want the money to sit in a bank account. I wanted it to go to the caregivers in Harrisburg and Philadelphia, who were currently where I had been on those 4:00 a.m. trains, in those cold waiting rooms, wondering how they were going to pay for the next round of meds, while their families looked the other way. I met with Rebecca Stone one last time, to finalize the 501c3 status. "You could just take this money and start over, Evelyn," she said, looking at the endowment papers. "You've earned a rest." "I am starting over, Rebecca," I told her, looking out the window at the city where I had spent 40 years being invisible. "I'm starting over as the person my father knew I was. He gave me the truth, so I could use it as a bridge for someone else. I'm not a ghost anymore. I'm a witness." That evening, I drove out to the cemetery alone. The snow was beginning to melt, revealing the dark, rich earth beneath. I sat on the small stone bench near Art's grave and watched the sunset paint the horizon in shades of deep violet and gold. The silence here was different now. It wasn't the silence of things left unsaid. It was the silence of a job well done. I thought about Eleanor, now living in a small, rented apartment in a town where nobody knew her name, and Cynthia, whose heroic journey had become a cautionary tale in every publishing house in New York. They were the ones who were invisible now, fading away into the consequences of their own choices. I reached out and touched the cool marble of the headstone. "The ledger is closed, Dad," I whispered. The packages were all delivered. Everyone got exactly what was in the envelope. I felt a breeze stir the trees around me, a soft, lingering sigh of the Pennsylvania winter. For the first time in my life, I wasn't waiting for the other shoe to drop. I wasn't waiting for someone to tell me I didn't belong. I stood up, brushed the dust from my coat, and walked toward the car. My father had spent his life delivering messages for strangers, but his final delivery was the one that mattered most. A message of freedom, written in the ink of a daughter's love and sealed with the ironclad promise of justice. I drove away into the twilight, finally, truly, at peace. The world feels different when you're no longer living as a ghost in someone else's play. For 43 years, I walked through the rooms of my life as if I were a guest who had overstayed her welcome, always waiting for the moment Eleanor would point to the door and remind me that I didn't belong. But as I stand here today, looking out at the vast, churning gray of the Atlantic Ocean, the salt air stinging my cheeks and the wind pulling at my hair, I finally understand that the silence my father kept wasn't a lack of love. It was a shield. Art Vance spent 4 decades navigating a storm of lies just to keep me within the warmth of a home, even if that home was built on shadows. He was a man who understood that the most important deliveries are the ones that take the longest to arrive. Now, the debt is paid, the truth is signed and sealed, and for the first time, I am breathing air that doesn't taste of someone else's resentment. The house in Harrisburg is sold. The designer dresses and fake smiles of my sister have faded into legal footnotes, and what remains is a legacy that blood alone could never create. I am his daughter, not because of a birth certificate, but because when the world went dark, we were the only ones who stayed to find the light. It's been exactly 1 year since the funeral that changed everything, the day my father's voice rang out from the grave to reclaim my life. I remember sitting in the back row of that cathedral, feeling as though the ceiling might collapse under the weight of the lies Cynthia was telling. Now, I'm sitting in a small sun-drenched office in downtown Harrisburg, looking at the plaque on the door that reads, Asterisk, the Art Vance Memorial Fund. Asterisk. It's a quiet space, filled with the smell of fresh coffee and the soft clicking of a keyboard, but to me, it's a cathedral of a different kind. We don't have camera crews here, and we don't have publicists. What we have are people who look just like I did 12 months ago. They come in with dark circles under their eyes and trembling hands, holding medical bills they can't pay and train tickets for trips they can't afford to take. I met a woman last week. Her name was Maria. She's 42, almost my age. She's been caring for her mother with late-stage Parkinson's, working 3 jobs just to keep the electricity on. When she sat across from me and told me she didn't think she could make it another month, I didn't just hear her story. I felt it in my bones. I reached into the drawer, pulled out a grant check for $10,000 from the settlement money Art had secured for me, and handed it to her. She didn't scream or celebrate. She just put her head in her hands and wept. In that moment, I realized that every hour I spent moving crates in the warehouse, every 4:30 a.m. train ride where I froze against the window, and every cold look from Eleanor was worth it. My father didn't just leave me a fortune. He left me the power to make sure that no one else has to be invisible while they are doing the holiest work on earth. The legal fallout for Eleanor and Cynthia has settled into a dull, permanent reality. Eleanor moved to a small town in South Carolina, living in a 1-bedroom apartment on her Social Security, stripped of the prestige she had traded my childhood for. I haven't spoken to her since the day I cleared out the house, and I don't intend to. There is a specific kind of peace that comes from finally stopping the search for water in a dry well. Cynthia's heroic memoir was never published, and the last I heard, she was working as an assistant for an insurance firm, her days of gala dinners and Netflix dreams replaced by the very menial work she once mocked me for. Their names have become cautionary tales in the publishing world, examples of what happens when you try to monetize a soul you never bothered to understand. But I don't spend my time thinking about them anymore. I think about Art. I think about the man who spent his life sorting through the world's messages, making sure that even the smallest, most battered envelope reached its destination. I realize now that he had been preparing me for this my whole life. Every time he showed me how to look at the details, every time he whispered, "Observe," he was teaching me how to see through the golden child and the grieving widow, to find the human beings underneath. He knew that one day I would need to be the inspector. He knew that one day I would be the one to verify the contents of our lives. A few days ago, I took a drive back to the old VFW hall, where he first met Eleanor in 1982. It's a weathered building now, with peeling paint and a sign that's missing a few letters. I sat in my car in the parking lot and watched the sunset, thinking about the choice he made. He could have walked away. He could have left me to the foster system, or let Sarah's memory fade into nothing. But he didn't. He stepped into a lie to protect a truth, the truth that I was his, and he was mine. He sacrificed his own happiness, living 40 years with a woman who didn't love him, just to make sure I was never alone. That isn't just a father's love. That's a hero's sacrifice. I finally moved into a small house near the coast, far away from the shadows of Harrisburg. It's a simple place, with a porch that looks out toward the water and a room filled with my father's old books and his service medals. On Sundays, Julian comes over. We sit on the deck, and he tells me stories about the old art, the man before the glioblastoma, the man who once tracked a stolen diamond through 3 states using nothing but a blurred postmark. We laugh, and we toast to the man who got the last word. I'm dating a man now, too. His name is Paul. He's an accountant, a quiet man who likes to hike and doesn't care about social media. When I told him my story, he didn't ask about the money or the Netflix deal. He just took my hand, looked at my warehouse scars, and said, "You must be exhausted. Let me carry the bags for a while." Standing here on the beach today, I feel the weight of the last year finally lifting, carried away by the tide. The sky is a brilliant, endless blue, reflecting the same clarity my father had in his final video. I am no longer defined by the debt I carried or the erasure I endured. I am defined by the fact that I stood my ground. I am defined by the 184 days I spent in those hospital rooms, and the fact that I never let go of his hand. My father gave me the truth, but more than that, he gave me back my name. I am Evelyn Vance, and I am finally, beautifully free. The story of Art Vance and his daughter comes to an end here, but the lesson of loyalty will resonate forever. If this story touched your heart, please leave a comment to share your feelings, subscribe to the channel to journey with me, and click to watch the next videos on the screen. Looking back at Evelyn's journey, I realized that those 184 days of caring for her father weren't just a duty. They were 184 days she lived true to her conscience. The dirty money from Cynthia's book finally vanished into thin air, but Evelyn's support fund will continue to help the world forever. Remember, blood may be a matter of fate, but it is love and sacrifice that truly define the meaning of family.